Hello and welcome to another edition of Sun Dragon Tips and Tricks. I was pondering what to do today. I'm Rebecca, by the way. I'm the owner of Sun Dragon Art and Fiber in downtown Brevard, North Carolina. But on Mondays, I film from my house. And I talk to you about some tips and tricks and fun ways to make knitting work and crochet work for you. So, you can see I'm a little off my game. I took a whole bunch of packages in this morning. I am just getting ramped up and it is midday already. So I was pondering what to do last night and I said, you know what? I've been promising or telling people I would do brioche for a really long time. Brioche is this really fun technique that people either have to do in hushed corners or they just fly through once they get the hang of it. And I wanted to share some tips and tricks on how to make brioche work for you. Essentially, there's one color and two color brioche. I like two color brioche, and I find the easiest way to learn two color brioche is to do it in the round. Do it in a circle. Because brioche essentially kind of looks like ribbing, knit one, purl one, but when you do it correctly with two colors, you get the knit stitches and the purl stitch. Knit stitches are one color, purl stitches are another color, and when you flip it inside out, it looks like the reverse. So on one side, color A, you'll see all the knit stitches running down and color B kind of recessed. And then you flip it over, you see color B with all the knit stitches running down and color A kind of recessed. And so if you're like, what? I meant to bring home from the shop an example of this, and I was in such a hurry to get to the post office this morning, I forgot. So take my word for it. If I can, I'll splice in some pictures, if I can find it, of brioche as we move to the whiteboard. But here's the deal. It took me this long to figure out how to do brioche because it's going to take a few sessions. And I was like, how do I break this up? What do I do? So this week, we're still only going to deal with one color. Because when you do two color brioche in the round, your first round is setup. Your first round is getting you ready to do the actual brioche. So we're going to learn some of the basics of brioche this week with only one color. We're not going to use our second color yet. We're only going to have one color involved. But we're going to get used to the idea of having a repetitive mantra and the way that a knit row will work. But this row is a little different than all the others, which is good. There's a lot of different tips to throw at you, and we'll only throw a couple of them at you this week. So let's get to it. So two color brioche when you're knitting. I'm going to call 101. We'll probably do a, say, 201 session, like the next level, or 102. I don't know. Which one do you like better? Let me know in the comments. So I find in the round is the easiest way to learn two color brioche, is to learn it in the round. And today we are only going to be doing part A, the setup knit row. There'll be a knit row and a purl row that will continue throughout the entire piece. But this is a version of the knit row. We're not into full-fledged brioche yet. If that's confusing, just hang on with me and we will keep talking about it. We'll keep helping you out with it. So, brioche is essentially kind of like knit one, purl one ribbing. But there's going to be slipped and wrapped stitches. There's going to be a rhythm to this to make it work out right. But essentially, it's a fancy version of knit one, purl one ribbing. So here are the first set of guidelines and tips that I would like you to keep in mind. Every row, including this row, every other stitch is going to be slipped. No matter what row we're on, we're going to be in a rhythm where you're working a stitch and slipping a stitch. So think about work, slip. You're going to be repeating that work, slip, work, slip. Now, what we do to work a stitch is going to change. However, every other stitch is slipped on every row. We'll see how that works out as we go. All of your slip stitches, which is every other stitch, are going to be slipped purlwise. Now, when we're talking about that, when the stitch is sitting on the needle, so here's our stitch, and here is our needle. When you knit it, you're actually twisting it. To knit it, you have to get your needle in this way. That's a knit stitch. Comes in from this side, and it twists it when it moves it over to the right needle. When you come at it purlwise, when you go in like you're going to purl, you don't twist it. You just stick your needle straight in. That's purlwise. It has nothing to do with where the yarn is. Usually when you slip a stitch, you're not using your working yarn. You're just moving a stitch from one side to the other. Here is what I find is the biggest hint, the biggest helpful tip, no matter what you're doing in brioche. Before you slip the stitch, the working yarn should be in front. There's in back and in front of the needle. Your working yarn should be in front of the needle before you slip any stitches. What that does, in case you're wondering about the logic of it, and we'll see it when we look over here, what that does is it makes sure your yarn over, yarn front, there's so much different language for it. It makes sure that your slip stitch gets a wrap. Your wrap is going to go over your slip stitch. The way you make sure that that happens and looks nice and works is your yarn needs to be in front before you slip a stitch. So working yarn should be in front before that stitch is slipped. That way, the yarn over, what a lot of patterns will call yarn over, yarn front, a lot of different ways that people talk about it. That's what can make brioche so confusing, is there's a lot of different ways it can be written. But that, we want the yarn, the working yarn, to wrap around the slip stitch. And that is a guaranteed way to make sure it happens, is your yarn needs to be in front. The other thing I find really helps, and we won't get into the specifics today, we'll just talk about this row's mantra, is that each row has a mantra, has a repeated phrase. Each row has a repeated phrase, has a mantra that is repeated to keep you on track. And here is the phrase for the setup row. Let's talk about it right now. The setup row is knit one, bring your yarn to the front, YF is yarn front. How many times can I rewrite it so it's maybe legible and maybe not confusing with other things I've written? Ha! Knit one, bring your yarn to the front, slip one. That's it. Now what's really important is you do not do extra things that are not written here. And I will come back to that with the drawings. Of don't do extra things. Excuse me while I catch a little bit of a typo or something that makes it hard to read. What some people will do is they'll knit one, they'll bring the yarn to the front, they'll slip one and say, now I should bring the yarn to the back. I didn't say to do that. All I said was bring your yarn to the front. There's a reason we're only doing these three things. Something will magically happen. That yarn over, that wrap that I talked about, will happen if you only do these three things. Side note, you don't need to worry about it till you finish the row. At the end of the row, you need to finish the wrap that will happen by bringing your yarn back to the front. Hang on to that, because that's the other thing that has most likely gone wackadoodle for people who are trying to do brioche in the round, is the beginning and end of the rows look weird. This will keep it from happening. So let's take a look at the pictures and see what's going to happen. One thing I should note before we go any further, I've got this mapped out. You can take a look to about 4 steps, 3 of which will get repeated. One thing to point out is prior to these steps, if you're starting from scratch, you're going to cast on your stitches and join to work in the round. So however many stitches you want for your cowl or infinity scarf, this is assuming you have already cast on your stitches and you are starting to work in the round. And one of the things I'll show you on this very first step is this is your stitch marker to show where the round begins and ends. Is my little black loop right there. So the first thing you're going to do from our mantra, let's write our mantra up here again. Here's our mantra, is knit one, yarn front, slip one. That's our mantra. Remember it. Knit one, yarn front, slip one. People use all kinds of different language for this second step that's going to happen. Sometimes they'll call it a yarn over, or sometimes they'll use the word wrap. As long as you understand what it means. But let's back up to here. A. The first thing you're going to do is knit. And you know how I like to break this down by colors. So, the beginning of the round, or we should say the end of the round when we joined it together, these are unworked stitches because we've just started a round. This is the end of the row right there. We're not going to do anything with those. We'll just color code them to get them out of the way. I think the working yarn on this one, I'm going to make purple. So we'll choose other colors for everything else. How about this first stitch that we are knitting? I'm going to make our tealy blue. Since this is our cast on row, I'll even color these little guys down here. Okay. How about our next one here? Good old orange. And the next stitch I'll make green. Yeah, changed my mind. I want a lighter color. I'm going to do the working yarn. I'm going to make pink. So what is happening in this picture right here? Remember, when you go into knit, you're twisting the stitch. This is what it looks like when you go to knit. And we have wrapped the working yarn around. And we're about to draw him back through. So first is just a regular knit stitch. You go in, wrap around, duck it back under. What that will look like, let's pull this over just a hair. Here's our knit stitch completed. Keep as much of this as I can in the frame. Here's our knit stitch completed. So what we have the end of the row back here. All the completed stitches in this sequence, I'm going to make pink because we're working with our working yarn. So for B, we have just completed our knit stitch. So the yarn that was up there is now down here. We have our other stitches hanging out. Here's the important thing for step B, the second part of our mantra. Yarn to the front. So what that means, the working yarn was in the back because when we knit, the yarn's in the back. But bring it between the needles to the front on this step. Again, if you want to call it a yarn over, if you're a continental knitter, it might be best to bring it forward and up and over your needle. I'm drawing this for English style knitters. Bring your yarn to the front and just let it hang there. Just keep it there. It'll be in front of any yarn that's connecting these needles. That's it. You've knit, bring your yarn to the front. The next step, the third part of your mantra, I'm going to see if I can keep as much of that knit stitch in there so we can go 1, 2, 3. You're going to slip that next stitch. The stitch you're slipping is that orange one. The biggest things to point out is this working yarn hasn't moved. It's hanging out in front. I'm not purling this stitch, but I am slipping it purl wise. And what that means is sticking your needle straight in to move it over as I color in everything else here. And notice in this drawing, just because we'll keep having stitches come at us, I put another stitch in over here. I'll just make him blue like the end of round stitches. So again, I'm spacing this out because I'm talking about it and color coding it. But knit, yarn to the front, slip. Now here's the important part of how this all makes sense. After you slip, the next thing you're doing is you're going back to the first step, which is knitting. But by leaving that yarn in front and then going to knit, here's what happens right there. You don't move your yarn to the back between the needles. You let the yarn carry. So this yarn is going to go up and over the needle to do its next thing. And it's going to look like this. Here's the craziness. So let's break it down, okay? We have... Here's the first stitch that we knit. Remember, we were working that light blue stitch. Here is the slip stitch. He's just moved needles. The stitch that we're now knitting is the green one. But by leaving our working yarn in front, when we go to knit it, so stick your needle in, your working yarn is going to lift over. It's going to wrap over as you bring your yarn up to go, then wrap around like it's supposed to do for a knit stitch. It wraps over your slip stitch and around your needle. Every slip stitch gets a wrap, and that's how it happens on a knit row. And these guys are just the next ones in the pipeline to have that same repetitive pattern happen to them. So that's the biggest thing that can throw off people's brioche on a knit row, on this setup row, is either they slip with the yarn in back so that the wrap doesn't, you will wrap your needle, but it ends up in the wrong place. Or they bring their yarn to the front and they slip, and then their subconscious says, oh, I got to bring my yarn to the back because I'm knitting. No, ignore that. Only do these 3 things. We're going to repeat steps B through D. So you're going to, you've knit, bring your yarn to the front, slip the next stitch, go ahead and knit. Don't do anything else. And this will do its really fun thing the way it's supposed to. Now, we should talk about the end of the row. We're going to repeat B through D, which B is up here. Yarn front, slip, knit. Yarn front, slip, knit. You will end on C. If you have an even number of stitches, which is what I highly recommend for this, you will end on C. I will add over here that you want, for the final shot, that the cast on of stitches should be an even number. You should end on a C. Now, here's the crazy part. Ending on a C, your yarn's in front, you've slipped a stitch. All your other knit stitches have locked the wrap in place by doing a knit stitch. There's no knit stitch at the end here. If you've done it correctly, look, this is how it should look. Let me just do the pink for you of what you've done. Knit, slip, and what ends up happening is a wrap. So knit, yarn front, slip. By knitting, the yarn comes over to work the stitch. Yarn comes front, slip a stitch. To knit the next stitch, the yarn has to wrap around to the back. You knit the next stitch, bring your yarn to the front, slip a stitch. In order to wrap it here, this last wrap, you actually have to bring the yarn, you actually have to wrap the yarn around the needle and back to the front. The last wrap happens by bringing your yarn between the needles to the front, over the right needle, back to the front, and leave that yarn in front. So it comes full circle to this guy. At the end of the row, finish by bringing the yarn to the front. It already is in front right here. You need to go over. You need to create the last wrap yourself. If that doesn't make sense, let's try looking at it with real yarn. So I've cast on about 50 stitches here with my really thick yarn. And my big needles, circulars this time. Still my likey needles, but they're circular this time. So we can join to work in the round. I put my stitch marker right there. Got my yarn set up. And I've done my best to try to make sure that my bottom edge is not twisting around my needle so that I can go. Remember, every other stitch is going to be slipped. So let's start our mantra. We've got knit, bring the yarn to the front, slip purlwise. Now leave the yarn in front right there. If we need to leave it hanging down to show you, I'm going to go to knit my next stitch. And your cast on row might be a little tight. Mine's probably going to be a little tight. But the yarn's in front. There's my knit stitch, my slip stitch. By going to knit while leaving it in front, it does what often is an accident if you don't bring your yarn to the back on a regular knit purl row. We want it to happen on purpose. By bringing my yarn around to knit, what happens is it crosses, it wraps. It wraps from front to back around. Here's the slip stitch, and here's my wrap. So again, I just knit yarn in front, slip purlwise by going straight in. This is knit, this is purl. Purlwise, go to knit my next stitch. This is going to wrap if I do it correctly. Yarn to the front, slip, knit. So let's start the mantra. The mantra is knit, yarn front, slip, knit, yarn front, slip. Now, here's where people will, if they're not thinking about it, their brain will go, well, you have to knit next, so you want to bring your yarn to the back. No, you really don't. See how that's not going to wrap your slip stitch. We want, when we look back, to see knit, straight up stitch, sideways, or a doubled stitch, what looks like a doubled with a straight and a slant over it. Knit, this should be straight with a slant. If we bring the yarn to the back, that is not going to happen. Leave the yarn in the front, because then when you knit, it creates that wrap. So knit, yarn to the front, slip, knit, yarn to the front, slip, knit. It's a little tough on my first row here. Yarn to the front, slip. Now, if you're a continental knitter, things are a little different with your mantra. You would knit, yarn to the front, but I would call it a yarn over because you're getting set up for the next stitch. Slip and knit. Does the same thing. Again, we want straight, straight and slanted, a doubled stitch, straight. Again, yarn over, slip. See, my brain wants to do silly stuff too. Knit. It's the same kind of mantra. There just might be some different words that will help you out with it. So we just knit, yarn over, slip, knit, yarn over, slip. Got to remember all 3 steps. Let me go back to the English style. Yarn's in front here. We've slipped. Here's that mantra. Knit, yarn front, slip purlwise. Knit, yarn front, slip purlwise. Knit, yarn front, slip purlwise. We're almost through the row. Let's just keep things going, maybe at a little bit of a faster pace. Slip, the yarn's in front. As I come up towards the end, and Avi is keeping me company, I often will repeat the phrase the whole time. So knit, yarn in front, slip. 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 I'm at the end, and here's the important thing. If we go back and look at all of these. Hi, Avi. You have straight, doubled, straight, doubled, straight. Yarn's in front, but if we leave it here without wrapping this last stitch, there's no knit stitch over on the side to lock it down. That's what's been happening the whole row. That's made life easy. So on this very last stitch, before we go to add the next color, which will be next week, we need to bring the yarn over and back to the front because we want it to match these other stitches that are every other stitch. Leave this guy in front, and we'll add our purl color next week. So what did I tell you? That took a little while, right? And that was just the first step. So stay tuned. We've got our setup row here. We're ready to add the second color and learn the purl version. The knit version of Brioche is really similar to this setup row. It's just from here on out, you always have a wrapped stitch and you always have a not wrapped stitch in succession. And it's what you do with those that makes the really cool design and effect that is Brioche. So I hope you'll join me next week when we will talk about the second color and what happens on a purl row and how it's different from a knit row. And then on week 3, we will revisit the knit row because that's when it's actually full-fledged brioche, so you can start to recognize things, and we'll take off from there. So I'm going to put as many of the tips of what I said in the description, as well as some possible, if you want just a little tight cowl to start this off, possible cast-on suggestions depending on what kind of yarn you want to use to get you started. But we will have to wait until next Monday to continue. If you have questions, you can always contact the shop or write comments and questions here. Let me know what you might like to see after brioche, because I'd like to do brioche on the round and then brioche flat, which is a little different, a little more advanced, but once you get the hang of this, some of that is actually easier too. So I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you will consider subscribing to this channel if you have not already, and let me know what you think. I like talking to people, whether it is on YouTube, on email, on the phone, all that fun stuff. So may your crafting be filled with joy and confidence, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye. Is someone hungry? Even though I've already fed you today? Yeah. Oh. I see. Is that why you were bugging me during filming? Wow. Okay. Hi. Okay, I get you some treats.